Thatcher government is a kind of an experiment in whether it will be possible in a democratic society that has gone as far as Britain has gone to change course in an orderly, effective way to set Britain on a new road. If the Thatcher government succeeds, it will be an example that will not be lost on the United States or the rest of the world.
The latest unemployed from the Royal Stafford helped form an unwelcoming committee for Mrs. Thatcher as she arrived at the...
But the economy did not behave in the way the monetarists predicted. The squeeze on money led to a wave of factory closures, while inflation continued to rise.
Wasn't it? Which factories closed?
A small one, which suffered lack of investment, among other things.
I've been in insolvency for all my professional life, and I think up until 1980, I used to go in with a great deal of confidence that with new management and perhaps some sort of reorganisation, something could be done. It was very sad to have to go onto the shop floor in the early 80s into a company knowing, in fact, that there wasn't much chance of selling that business, and that, in fact, the business would come to an end.
This is what would normally be a working day. It's the middle of the week, and we're now down in this plant, which produces well over half the cast iron baths for the United Kingdom, on to 1 week on, 1 week off. And that's an immediate and practical effect of the strict monetarism policy that the government is carrying out.
The managing director said, I'm very sorry to tell you, but as from this minute the firm has gone into voluntary liquidation. That was it.
Somebody shouted, will we get any wages? And he said, you'll get nothing.
There now follows a government statement on the current employment figures.
Oh, dear. Oh, dear, oh, dear, oh, dear. The government seems to have totally lost its way in terms of the interaction of 4 economic indicators on British industry. Oh, God. As every member of any firm knows, once, with high interest rates as a weapon for controlling money supply, what is the first thing that has to be cut? Investment. Because you still have to pay wages and you still have to pay your current costs.
One day we may be able to afford it. I get the economic policies right.
The government would say, just hang on and stop making such a fuss now.
Yeah, all I can say is that the government isn't standing where I'm bloody well standing.
Even more mystifying was the behaviour of the money supply. Despite the squeeze, it was still growing, something the monetarists thought impossible.
Well, it was all a bit embarrassing, people like me who were at the Bank of England, because we'd been forced, the government had signed up for this path of gently declining monetary aggregates. And instead of the monetary aggregates gently declining, some 5 or 6 months after this new policy was put into operation, they took an enormous jump, and it was very difficult to know why, or to know what ought to be done about it.
By the end of 1980, unemployment had nearly doubled. Manufacturing output had fallen by 1/6. Britain was declining faster than even in the darkest days of the 1930s. Despite this, the politicians were convinced they were right. The laws of their science told them so.
Let me just have a word about monetarism and monetary control first. I mean, you all know full well that if you produce too much of something, its value will fall. That's elementary. It isn't a newfangled theory. It is as essential as the law of gravity, and you can't avoid it.
People used to say, you're destroying my job, and I was absolutely secure in my conscience that their negotiators and their employers were destroying their jobs by not following rational expectations and seeing that if they didn't accommodate unit labor costs by a combination of pay increases allowed and rising productivity to what would keep their prices internationally competitive, jobs would go. So there was I, absolutely clear in my conscience, and there were they convinced in their, what I would call invincible ignorance, that I was an enemy. Yes, it was an awkward time.
There's no question that what was happening did, in my view, a great deal of damage to the economy. The politicians of the day will never admit to that. They never admit to making mistakes at all. But it's quite clear that's what was happening. They were trying to do it right, but they got it wrong.
Rise. It became clear that the fundamental law of monetarism, the relationship between the money supply and inflation, didn't work. Ever so quietly, this solution to Britain's problems was discarded. Finally, the man who had first brought the monetarist message to Britain was publicly told it was over.
Monetarist economists believe in something called the natural rate of unemployment, which is supposed to be the rate at which inflation stops or ceases to accelerate. Now, do you think that we, Prime Minister, with all-time record unemployment figures this week, have yet reached that natural rate, even though inflation is still proceeding sufficiently to halve the value of money every 15 years?
It's not a doctrine to which I've ever subscribed. It's one which I think actually came in with Milton Friedman. I used to read about it, I used to look about it. It's not a doctrine, it's a theory to which I've never subscribed.
Some of those who had lived through the experiment now became deeply pessimistic.
Used to think that unit labour costs were a matter of market movement and not something to do with politicians. The Prime Minister realised that Britain now has the highest inflation and the lowest growth rate of any of the major industrialised countries. Does she know that it is now 3 years since we last had a monthly balance of payments surplus? Is she willing to recognise that no government has ever had it so wrong for so long? And doesn't she think that she owes it to the country to change from her disastrous policies?